Nothing But the Truth.
Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa of India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. This is my weekly x-ray of key issues that matter to you without holding back on the truth. In this episode, we will analyze the emergence of a new kind of political playbook being written right here in our subcontinent. This time, it's being executed by young voters who seem to have found what one could call only a metronomic rhythm in how they force governments to change midstream. And here's the kicker. It's powerful, it's fast, it's dramatic, but it is far from democratic. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, we would look at the latest example, which is the so-called Gen Z rebellion in Nepal, which has toppled the ruling establishment under very dramatic and violent circumstances. We will go into the reasons behind it and what is the future for Nepal and what does all this mean for India and the region. But first, let's take a look at the wave of such movements in recent years. Take one is Sri Lanka. And if you recall, let's rewind to July 2022. Sri Lanka was economically broken then. There were long fuel queues. In fact, fuel prices had shot up atrociously. There were food shortages, and people's savings were simply wiped out in months. Out of this desperation, jobless youth banded together to form what is called the Aragalaya, or the struggle. Now, they didn't just protest with placards. They stormed the actual citadels of power, the president's residence, the prime minister's office, even the parliament. The ruling Rajapaksa family, who thought they were untouchable, fled in the middle of the night, and within weeks, a new interim government was sworn in. So that was the first playbook page. Young people on the streets, united by anger, leveraging sheer number and fearlessness to topple power, especially the key power structures. Of course, all of us watched in astonishment because we had never seen scenes like that in recent times in the subcontinent. And here was Sri Lanka, a government that looked stable, strong, taken down overnight. And then take two is Bangladesh. This time in August 2024, the spark wasn't fuel, but jobs in Bangladesh. University students were protesting against job reservation, something they felt was stacked against them. The police, instead of listening, opened fire, and more than 100 students died. That's when the youth retaliated in fury, vandalizing symbols of power, the parliament, government buildings, and even the statue of who was seen as the father of the nation, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, the daughter of Mujibur Rahman, who had ruled for more than a decade, had to be evacuated in a military aircraft to India because the mob was heading to lynch her. Now, again, like Sri Lanka, a playbook page was written that if you push the youth to the wall, they won't just shout, they will burn the house down, sometimes literally. Now let's take a look at the most recent episode, which is Take 3, Nepal. And we all saw in September that the latest chapter was being written where a government led by Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli thought it could flex its muscles by banning 26 social media platforms overnight. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, Reddit, all were banned at that time. And for young Nepalis, this wasn't about memes or reels. It was about their livelihood, their communication, staying in touch with their families abroad, and even finding work. Now, there were peaceful protests in Kathmandu, but they were met with bullets. The police shot in broad daylight 19 youngsters, and more are expected to have been either seriously injured or these shots would prove fatal. And that flipped the switch, and we saw the streets explode into violence. Again, with astonishment, we haven't, as I said, been used to this kind of shock treatment that goes on. And the protesters didn't stop at Parliament. They torched the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the Prime Minister's residence, even the Supreme Court. Now, leaders across party lines were attacked. Sher Bahadur Duba, Jalanath Khanal, names that had dominated Nepal's politics for decades, suddenly found their homes on fire. In fact, Khanal's wife tragically died from burn injuries. For 2 days, Nepal was on fire until the army marched in and restored calm, but the damage was done. President Ramchandra Paudal and Prime Minister Oli had fled, and once again, the subcontinent's youth had brought down a government without ever contesting an election. So now let's get into why did Nepal's youth revolt in the manner they did. And the immediate trigger for the so-called Gen Z's rebellion, and Gen Z, mind you, is seen as the age group between 15 and, say, 28. That's the age group that they looked at and defined as the Gen Z. This started, as we thought, was because of the peremptory ban of 26 major social media platforms, which I'd mentioned earlier, including Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, X, Reddit, and LinkedIn. The Oli government is supposed to block these for their failure, these big media giants' failure to meet the one-week deadline to register locally. They were supposed to appoint grievance officers and establish a point of contact, as India had done a couple of years ago. Now, Nepali officials argued that they were simply enforcing a Supreme Court-aligned directive and sovereignty over digital space. But for millions of Nepalis, especially the young, social media platforms are not a luxury. They are critical tools for livelihood, communication, and a lifeline to their families, particularly those who are abroad. And in fact, Nepal has one of South Asia's highest users of social media platforms. Now, within hours of the blackout, anger boiled over into the streets and ended in a regime change. Resentment, though, did not come out of nowhere. Ranjit Ray, a former Indian ambassador to Nepal and an expert on the subject, told me the signs were there for a long, long time. There was huge anger about corruption and what he called the unholy coalition formed to protect leaders from investigation. Now, the controversy over the platforms merely lit the fuse. In the weeks before the ban, if you looked at the social media posts, the hashtags were things like Nepo babies and Nepo kids that had been trending in Nepal as citizens contrasted their stagnating lifestyle with the conspicuous consumption of various sons of political and daughters of political families who flaunted their Rolex watches, Gucci bags, and Instagram posts. For many ordinary Nepalis, by contrast, migration has been the only escape from shrinking domestic opportunities. A lot of them work as labor, and in contrast to the way the rich lived, the villages had hollowed out. Parents lived a great distance from their children, and only remittances that they sent from abroad sustained their consumption, but did nothing to build their capacity or earning or fulfill their aspirations. The major issue Gen Z is facing in Nepal is, as we can see, the mounting economic distress brought on by joblessness, with successive governments failing to address the issue. And this was heightened during COVID, which saw unemployment only worsen, and in fact hastened migration to other countries, especially those who are under the age of 30. Now, this is a cohort that accounts for nearly 56% of Nepal's total population of 29.6 million. So while Nepal's overall unemployment rate stood at 10.8% in 2024, in this particular age group, it was 20.8%, or nearly double that for what we call the Gen Z age group. Now, the lack of job opportunities saw an estimated 4.5 million of Nepalis migrating to other countries like India, the Gulf nations, and the Far East for employment. Remittances by Nepalis working abroad, in fact, form the backbone of the domestic economy, accounting for 33% of the GDP, according to the World Bank. Now, remittance inflows accounted for close to $14 billion in 2024 alone, and nearly 76%, that is close to 3 out of 4 Nepali households, were found to rely on them, and sometimes the contribution from remittances was almost a third of the household incomes. That's what studies show, and that is the seriousness of the problem that Nepalis have. They cannot find jobs in their own country. They migrate. They live in really tough conditions across, and the resentment against the ruling elite began to grow as they flaunted their wealth while the youth had to struggle, and in fact, a lot of them didn't have jobs. Now, the other major issue was that what we call the musical chairs of Nepali politics, and we've seen that over the past few decades, power has alternated with an old triumvirate of leaders from three major political parties. Sher Bahadur Duba of the Nepali Congress, or NC, who was prime minister for 5 times, if one includes the days of the monarchy. 5 times Duba was prime minister. Then there was Pushpa Kumar Dahal Prachanda of the Communist Party of Nepal, Mao Center, or CPM-MC, who was PM for 4 times, and he was the ultimate rebel that had a lot to do with, along with his colleagues or comrades, to topple the monarchy in 2008, or even before that, the revolt that they had put up. And of course, there is KP Sharma Oli, who belongs to the Communist Party of Nepal, unified Marxist-Leninists, all big mouth twisters, but essentially the abbreviation is CPN-UML. And Oli was serving for his 4th term before it was brought to an abrupt end. Though these leaders occupied the central orbit of power till recently, all these 3 leaders, not only was their gravitational pull weakening, their resonance among the youth too was waning, as they increasingly appeared to become what experts say disconnected with the aspirations of the youth. And that was compounded by rapacious corruption and nepotism that had become endemic in Nepal, with the top leaders accused of being at the heart of the rot. And this is one of the big problems. So I told you first, it was the joblessness and the fact that many Nepalis had to go abroad and migrate and earn an income and couldn't do so with their own country, particularly the youth, and joblessness was very, very high. Second was the fact that you had effete political leaders who dominated the scene, many of them 4 times prime minister, and they were not representative of change. They did not understand the aspirations of the young in Nepal. Moreover, after the abolition of the monarchy in 2008 and a new constitution coming into force in 2015, Nepal, unfortunately, has had continuing political instability. Now, that's one of the big reasons that we see, because there were as many as 14 changes in government in the past 17 years alone, which is when from 2008 to 2025, if you look at 14 changes have happened in these 17 years, and you can imagine it's almost every year that a government changed. And one reason for this endemic instability is Nepal's mixed electoral system, which doesn't readily enable a full majority. In fact, no party has got a full majority since the constitution has come into force in 2015. And let me just give you some figures of that. Of the 275 seats in the lower house, 165 are filled through a first-past-the-post mechanism, very much like India. If you get the maximum votes, you get elected. But another 110 seats are filled with what is called proportional representation based on party vote share. So if a party got 25%, that party was allotted a certain number of seats. So that has seen no major political party, as I said earlier, cross the simple majority of 138 seats to form a government on its own. And this has resulted in a series of coalition governments which make their compromises, and particularly the current arrangement, which has been dismantled, had all the power but didn't seem to be delivering. Now, compounding the nation's problems is, again, Nepal's social geography, which is distributed across 3 major population groups, who are actually seemingly out of sync with each other. Let me just tell you this because it's so interesting to understand what is happening in Nepal and why did it happen over there and why the strife happened. And here are these 3 groups, and they are the Pahadis, which are the hill origin caste groups comprising of the dominant Bahun or the Brahmin, Kshetri or Kshatriya, and the Thakuri communities. And they account for close to 31% of the population. And most of them are the political elite, and they dominate the capital and the areas surrounding that. The second are the Janajatis, or the Adavasis, or indigenous nationalities, and they are spread across the hills and plains, and they account for another 31%, and are often classified as underprivileged because the conditions that they live in are not as good as the other sectors of the population in Nepal. And the third big group is the Madhesi, or the Terai or plains origin people, who constitute about 28% and live in districts bordering India, and therefore have some sort of, not an alliance or anything like that, but certainly a tilt towards India because of the kind of symbiotic relationship that exists between India and the people that live in the Terai region of Nepal. But this has led to constant power tussles within the three groups and has made the country's polity less cohesive. So, apart from the fact that you had tired old leaders who had dominated the politics, you had an inbuilt instability into the electoral polity, and because of the various groups and the pressures and pulls, not that you don't have it in India, but here it was pretty obvious because you had this new constitution with this proportionate representation system, and that began to see largely minority governments coming to power. Now, so what happens next? That's the big question. What is likely to happen to Nepal in the near future? Of course, let's eliminate each of these options that are being thrown up. Now, unlike Bangladesh or Pakistan's coup-prone history, where the military took over in crisis situations, and we have seen that in Bangladesh, we've seen that in Pakistan. Nepal is different. The military is its backbone, but has no ambitions of taking over. India Today spoke to Major General Binod Basanyat, a former general officer commanding of the Eastern Division of the Nepali Army, and he told us that the armed forces always follow the constitutional arrangement and harbor no political ambitions. The general went on to tell us that this has been the defining character of the army. It is instilled through its upbringing and institutional culture. Whenever the army is entrusted with the responsibility of upholding constitutional rights, it fulfills that role. So he was very clear that there is no question of an army coup or the army taking over. This was reaffirmed by Manjeev Singh Puri, a former Indian ambassador to Nepal, another expert on the country, and he says the Nepali army knows the country's proud struggle for democracy by overthrowing the monarchy. And if you recall, this was almost a 10-year battle where they fought and toppled the king. And therefore, he says, their army has the same ethos as the Indian army. And he put it very nicely. If someone asked an Indian army general to take over the country, would that general do so? So instead, Manjeev Puri expects what he calls a techno-political government that is a mix of professionals, bureaucrats, economists, and judicial experts, besides younger political voices, to be part of the new power structure. That is still being evolved as we speak, but whatever the nature of any interim dispensation in Nepal, it will have to work towards eventually establishing a democratically elected government that meets the aspirations of the young. And we saw that happening in Sri Lanka, and this is the way Nepal should go. Bangladesh is yet to hold its election, and one hopes that that process will also happen because democracy is critical in the subcontinent. There were, of course, and this was another big discussion that was going on, concerns among some quarters that all this was to push or a push towards the return of the monarchy, especially when Nepali Army Chief General Ashok Raj Sigdel addressed the nation to quell the nationwide protests, and he had behind him a portrait of Prithviraj Narayan Shah, or Prithvi Narayan Shah, the 18th century founder of modern Nepal, and the symbolism was unmistakable. Many wondered if royalist forces would return, riding the new wave of anger that had spread across Nepal. And royalist sentiment has, in fact, been flickering for years after the 2008 toppling of the monarchy. And in November 2023, thousands rallied in Kathmandu, including members of the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, a Hindu right wing establishment, for the revival of the monarchy and a Hindu Rashtra, and they clashed with the police at that time. The former king, Gyanendra, who's now Gyanendra Shah, who's now 78 years old, had ruled Nepal from 2001 to 2008 before he was overthrown, as I mentioned, by popular protest, and that ended the monarchy. He currently lives in the Nirmal Niwas Palace in Kathmandu, and people say he continues to nurture hopes of a return to power. Now, some see royalist interest in engineering the collapse of the constitution that abolished the monarchy, but other experts are clear, and many Indian ambassadors believe that the monarchy is over. And as one of them told me, some may hanker for the monarchy, but the current revolt was not, or certainly not, for that. Now let's look at what does all this mean for India. Any turmoil within Nepal inevitably spills over, because we have a 1,700 kilometer open border abutting 5 Indian states. And if you take a look at the map, it's Uttarakhand, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Sikkim, and West Bengal. That's a long border, and porous because we allow free movement between the two countries. Now, New Delhi's instinct, or India's instinct, so far has been restraint. Now, after a meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Security, Prime Minister Narendra Modi issued a very carefully worded message, and this was in English, Hindi, and Nepali, calling the violence that happened heartrending, mourning the young dead, and urging peace. So the goal for India is clear: engage quietly, avoid the so-called "we fixed it" optics that fuel anti-Indian narratives, and that happens very frequently. And of course, keep critical cooperation such as in trade, energy, and connectivity, and keep them on track. In fact, India should counsel quietly, Nepal quietly on issues such as peace, engagement, trade, and as one ambassador said, Ranjit Ray, told me that India should avoid grandstanding and rather work very quietly with them on all the key issues that confront them. There are, of course, a lot of friction between India and Nepal. The border map dispute over the territorial rights of what are Lipu Lake, Kalapani, and Limpiyadura. I may not get the pronunciations right, but these are places at the tri-junction of India, Nepal, and China, and remains a permanent irritant. If you recall, the issue escalated in 2020 when Nepal under Oli, Prime Minister Oli, published a new political map claiming these areas and citing the 1816 Sugauli Treaty, which defines the Kali River as the western boundary. Now, Nepal claims that the river originates west of Kalapani, placing the disputed land well within its territory. India, however, asserts that the river originates further east, making it part of Uttarakhand. Now, tensions flared up after India inaugurated a road to the Lipu Lake Pass in May 2020. Nepal called it a violation of sovereignty, while India dismissed the claims, calling the area as part of India. For Oli, long known for calibrating nationalist rhetoric under India's shadow while quoting China, the border dispute offered a perfect opportunity for domestic mobilization. Ambassador Manjeev Puri told me, once you finger things cartographically, it lingers on. Maps become an agenda item and need to be tackled. Oli had crossed the red line because he knew it would get anti-India votes in the election. Even in his earliest stint as Prime Minister, Oli had irked India, first by signing a transit pact with China in 2016, then the famed Belt and Road or BRI initiative in 2017, and in fact, as recent as 2024, sought fresh deals with China, even though many of the BRI projects that China had been given had been stalled. New Delhi has always read Prime Minister Oli's tilt or ex-Prime Minister Oli's tilt warily. Kathmandu saw it as a leverage, but most of Nepal's urgent needs, such as power, or sales of power, ports, pipes, oil pipes that go there, medicine, education, can best be met by India. Geography, in fact, determines all this. Maps alone do not make neighbors. It is people who do. And an estimated 2 million Nepalis live and work in India, crossing the frontier daily, and the armies of the two countries have shared uniforms under the Gorkha crest. This human interface is the best guardrail against geopolitical opportunism and the best reason for everyone in Kathmandu and Delhi to tread very carefully. Now let's look at China's role, which is less immediate, but let us not assume that they would become absent. Remember, money talks, and China has plenty of it, and the governments listen, as an analyst told me. In moments of vacuum like this analyst warns that checkbooks can speak louder than words, and China's always ready with it. Of course, given the proximity of India and Nepal and the fact that they share such a large border, it is imperative for Nepal also to maintain a positive relationship with India. Let's not forget, trade between India and Nepal amounted to $8.5 billion. This was last year, with the balance tilted heavily in India's favor, which enjoys a massive surplus of $6.1 billion. Now, apart from trade, India buys hydroelectric power from Nepal, which I mentioned earlier, has provided a pipeline for oil supply to Nepal, saving it crores of rupees in transportation, and is involved in providing for a range of development projects from education to healthcare. So, it's in India's interest and Nepal's interest to be engaged with each other, India to carry out quiet diplomacy, and that is the approach that a lot of experts say, and make sure that this doesn't turn out to be an anti-India rhetoric. So what next for Nepal? The most realistic near-term path is a narrow mandate for the caretaker, which the government that is expected to come in soon if the consensus is reached. Very important, law and order has to be stabilized. All the services, civic services have to be restored. You have to lift the blanket digital bans and replace them with lawful, transparent engagement. The new dispensation must create a credible timeline for elections and audit the use of force that killed so many people. On the economic front, the caretaker government should accelerate hydropower milestones, fast-track cross-border power trade, expand vocational pipelines linked to actual placement, and they have to craft a diaspora-friendly reintegration for returnees with capitals or skills. This is what experts say, that the new caretaker government must look afresh at all the problems that Nepal faces, because that was the revolt of the youth. And they need to also, while confronting the elite, not indulge in excessive or vindictive behavior, but bring about institutional reforms that make corruption harder and punishment real, and institute what everyone wants, the youth want, which is credible accountability. Of course, Nepal is at a critical crossroads, and as one analyst told me, from the ashes that we saw on the streets of Nepal and the buildings of Nepal and the violent protest, Nepal will emerge something stronger and better, and will have certainly more democracy. Now, that is a hope as much as a forecast, and we hope that does happen for Nepal. For more details, you can read my in-depth cover on the subject in India Today, written along with my colleague Pradeep Sagar. You can also hear an audio podcast on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Thank you for being with me in this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week. Nothing but the truth.